It was a beautiful Saturday afternoon, and the sun was shining brightly in the sky. The warm weather made it the perfect day for a family BBQ. The smell of sizzling burgers and grilled vegetables filled the air, blending with the laughter and chatter of children running around the backyard. It was the kind of day that everyone looked forward to. A simple, peaceful gathering where family could relax, enjoy good food, and make happy memories together. The family had been planning this BBQ for weeks. The father had spent the morning prepping the grill, while his wife arranged plates of salads, fruits, and sides to go with the meal. The kids had made a game of helping with the decorations, adding colorful balloons and streamers around the yard. They were excited to see their cousins and friends, and there was an air of joy and excitement that filled the space. As the sun climbed higher, the guests started arriving. Laughter filled the air as people greeted one another with hugs and smiles. The kids, already full of energy, dashed around the yard, playing tag and jumping on the trampoline. The adults found seats at the picnic table, catching up with each other over drinks and snacks. Everyone was having a great time, enjoying the warmth of the day and the company of loved ones. But just a few houses down, a different kind of atmosphere lingered. Mr. Thompson, the neighbor next door, was watching from his front porch, his arms crossed tightly across his chest. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't chatting with anyone. He stood there, glaring across the street, his expression hard and unfriendly. It wasn't the first time that Mr. Thompson had been unhappy with the noise from the backyard. Over the years, the family had learned to keep things quiet when they saw him outside, as he often seemed bothered by the sounds of children playing and the chatter that floated over the fence. But today, something felt different. Mr. Thompson's scowl was deeper, his posture more tense. As the BBQ continued, the sounds of music and laughter only seemed to bother him more. Every burst of laughter, every cheer, seemed to annoy him more than the last. It was as though the family's joy was a direct challenge to his peace and quiet. Finally, after a few more minutes of standing on his porch, Mr. Thompson could take it no longer. He walked down his driveway with purpose, heading straight for the family's backyard. No one had noticed him at first. Everyone was caught up in the celebration. But as he reached the gate, he knocked loudly. The father, who was flipping burgers at the grill, turned around in surprise. Mr. Thompson's voice rang out, sharp and annoyed. He demanded that the family turn down the music and keep the noise down. The father, never one to argue, wiped his hands on a towel and walked over to the gate to speak with him. He greeted Mr. Thompson politely, asking if there was a problem. But Mr. Thompson didn't seem interested in politeness. He was already upset, his face twisted with irritation. He made it clear that he didn't want to hear any more noise, his words cutting through the calm of the day. At first, the father tried to reason with him, explaining that it was just a small family gathering and they would try to keep things quieter. But Mr. Thompson wasn't having it. His frustration was clear, and he quickly escalated the situation by making a cruel, unnecessary remark about how he didn't want people like them disrupting his peaceful neighborhood. The words hung in the air, sharp and harsh, as the father stood there in shock. The family had always tried to be respectful to Mr. Thompson, even though he kept to himself and often seemed bothered by the simplest things. But now, his words had crossed a line. The father wasn't sure how to respond. He stood there for a moment, taking in what had just been said, unsure of how to handle the situation. The joy of the BBQ seemed to vanish for a moment, replaced by an uncomfortable tension that no one had expected. It was clear that Mr. Thompson's anger went beyond just the noise. It was something deeper, something that the family had never anticipated. And so, as the BBQ continued in the background, the father took a deep breath, preparing to do something he hadn't planned. This wouldn't be just another neighborhood confrontation. This was about to turn into something. The father stood there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. Mr. Thompson's words were like a slap in the face. He had been calm and polite, trying to make the best of the situation, But now things had escalated in a way he didn't expect. The whole family had worked hard to make the day special. It wasn't just about the BBQ. It was about coming together, enjoying each other's company, and making memories. But now, Mr. Thompson's comments had made everything feel tense, even though the father knew he didn't want to ruin the day. As the father stood there, Mr. Thompson's glare didn't soften. His arms remained crossed, and he looked as though he was waiting for a reaction. The father took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. It would have been easy to snap back with anger or to tell Mr. Thompson off. After all, who wouldn't be upset at being treated like that in front of their family? But the father knew that responding with more anger would only make things worse. He wanted to find a way to end the confrontation without turning it into something bigger. He turned and looked over his shoulder, making sure the kids were still inside, safe and unaware of the tension building just beyond the backyard fence. His wife, who had been chatting with some of the other guests, hadn't seen the exchange either. The father knew it was better this way. He didn't want to bring any more negativity into the day, especially for the children who had been looking forward to this BBQ for weeks. He had to handle it quickly, and he had to handle it right. Slowly, the father walked a few steps closer to Mr. Thompson, still trying to decide what to say next. His mind raced as he thought about what had just been said. It wasn't the first time Mr. Thompson had been difficult. He had always kept to himself and seemed annoyed by any noise or activity around him. Over the years, the father had learned to simply let things slide. After all, everyone had their quirks. But today, it felt different. It wasn't just about noise anymore. It was about something much deeper, something that had no place in a community where people were supposed to live in harmony. Mr. Thompson, still standing with his arms crossed, was watching him closely, waiting for a response. The father could feel the tension in the air, and it wasn't just coming from the old man. The entire situation felt off, and he knew it was time to end it, once and for all. Instead of arguing or getting defensive, the father made a choice. He took another deep breath and decided to address Mr. Thompson directly. "I know you're upset," the father began, his voice calm but firm. "And I'm sorry if the noise has bothered you." He paused, looking Mr. Thompson in the eye. "But I can't let you speak to my family that way." Mr. Thompson raised an eyebrow, clearly not expecting this response. He probably thought the father would back down or apologize, but the father wasn't about to do that. Not this time. "I know it's not always easy living next to people," the father continued, "but we all deserve respect. No one deserves to be spoken to like that, especially not in their own home." The father's words weren't harsh, but they were clear. He wasn't looking for a fight, but he wasn't going to let Mr. Thompson get away with making hurtful comments either. For a brief moment, Mr. Thompson seemed to be caught off guard. He didn't say anything, his lips pressed tightly together as he seemed to weigh the father's words. The father had expected some kind of argument, maybe an even harsher response, but instead, Mr. Thompson stood still, staring at the ground for a moment as if thinking about what had just been said. The father could see the confusion in Mr. Thompson's face, like he didn't quite know how to respond. He had probably been used to getting his way for a long time, shutting people down whenever he felt like it. But now, something was different. The father wasn't backing down. He wasn't going to let Mr. Thompson's anger take over the day. After what felt like an eternity, Mr. Thompson finally looked up. His expression hadn't softened completely, but there was a shift. Maybe it was the father's calm, steady voice, or maybe it was the fact that he had stood up for his family. Either way, something about the situation had changed. Mr. Thompson didn't seem as angry as before, but he also didn't seem like he knew how to handle the situation now. For a few more moments, neither of them said anything. It was a strange kind of silence, one that seemed to hang in the air between them, but also seemed to quiet the growing tension in the neighborhood. The BBQ continued in the background, people talking and laughing as though nothing was out of place. But for the father and Mr. Thompson, something The tension in the air was thick, and for a moment, it seemed like everything had come to a halt. The laughter and music from the BBQ felt miles away, as if they were part of a different world. The father stood facing Mr. Thompson, unsure of how this conversation would unfold. He had hoped his words would reach the old man, but he couldn't be sure. The silence between them was heavy, almost uncomfortable. Mr. Thompson's face was still hard, his arms still crossed tightly. But now there was a flicker of something else. Maybe confusion, maybe uncertainty. The father didn't back down. He knew he couldn't. He had worked too hard to make this day special for his family, and he wasn't going to let anyone ruin it, especially not a neighbor who had made it clear for years that he didn't want to be a part of the community. But the father also knew that shouting or arguing wasn't the answer. He had learned over the years that sometimes the best way to deal with difficult people wasn't to get louder, but to be calm, steady, and firm. He hoped Mr. Thompson would see that. Finally, after what felt like forever, Mr. Thompson let out a sigh, his arms slowly unfolding. He didn't say anything at first, just stared down at the ground, as if he were weighing his next words carefully. The father, trying to stay patient, waited for him to speak. He had no idea what Mr. Thompson was thinking, but he knew that something had to give. The old man's anger, while still there, seemed to have lost some of its fire. After a long moment, Mr. Thompson muttered, "I didn't mean to offend you. I don't like all the noise." His voice was quieter now, less harsh than before, and the father could hear a hint of something. Maybe regret? Or maybe it was just the realization that his words had gone too far. The father wasn't sure, but it was a shift, a small change from the angry man who had stormed into the backyard just moments before. The father could have easily gotten defensive, could have said something like, "You've been bothering us for years," or "Why do you always act like this?" But he didn't. He had learned that fighting fire with fire didn't always lead to the best outcome. Instead, he simply nodded, acknowledging what Mr. Thompson had said. "I understand," he said gently. "It's just that today's special for us. We don't mean to cause any trouble." Mr. Thompson looked up, his eyes meeting the father's. There was still some tension in his gaze, but it wasn't as fierce as before. "I know," he muttered. "I'm just not used to all this noise. I'm getting old, and it's harder to deal with stuff like this." For a brief second, the father was surprised by the admission. He had never really thought about Mr. Thompson as someone who might be struggling with anything personal. He had always assumed the man was just grouchy, someone who liked to complain for the sake of complaining. But hearing him speak about getting older and finding it harder to handle things made the father pause. Maybe there was more to Mr. Thompson's behavior than he had realized. Maybe he wasn't just a bitter old man. Maybe he was someone who needed a little understanding. The father softened a little. "It's okay," he said, his voice calm but kind. "We can keep it down, but just know that it's all in good fun. It's a family gathering, and we're not trying to upset anyone." He wasn't making excuses for the noise, but he was offering Mr. Thompson a chance to see that there was no malice behind it. Mr. Thompson didn't say anything at first. He seemed to be considering the father's words, his gaze drifting off to the side. For a moment, the father thought he might just walk away, muttering something under his breath. But instead, the old man surprised him. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice quieter now, almost hesitant. "I shouldn't have said what I did. It was wrong." The father nodded, not because he expected an apology, but because it felt like a small victory. Not for him, but for the situation as a whole. The conversation had shifted from a confrontation to a brief moment of understanding, and that was all he needed. He didn't expect Mr. Thompson to become a new neighbor overnight or to suddenly become friendly, but this was progress. That was enough. As the father turned to walk back to the grill, he glanced over at the BBQ. His wife and kids were still enjoying themselves, oblivious to the small drama that had unfolded in the corner of the yard. The laughter and chatter had picked up again, and the sun was starting to set, casting a warm glow over everything. The day wasn't ruined. The family wasn't going to let one difficult person spoil their time together. Mr. Thompson didn't follow the father back to the BBQ. Instead, he turned and walked back to his house. His steps, as the father returned to the grill, he couldn't help but take a deep breath. The conversation with Mr. Thompson had been unexpectedly tense, but it also felt like a weight had been lifted. It wasn't about winning an argument. It was about preserving the peace, protecting the joy of the day, and not letting anyone's bad mood spoil what had been a perfectly good afternoon. As he turned the burgers on the grill and checked the hot dogs, he glanced over at his family, who were still laughing and chatting, completely unaware of the tense moment just outside the yard. His wife, who had noticed him walking back from the gate, smiled at him warmly. "Everything okay?" she asked, her tone soft, though there was a hint of concern in her eyes. She had been busy with the drinks and the sides and hadn't noticed the exchange with the neighbor. The father didn't want to bring up the details. There was no point in upsetting her. "Yeah, it's fine," he said, his voice casual. He just needed a little reminder about respecting people's space. "We're all good." His wife gave him a look, sensing that there was more to the story, but she didn't press him. Instead, she nodded and returned to her conversation with the guests. It wasn't the first time a neighbor had caused a little trouble, and she trusted that her husband had handled it in his own way. She had always admired his ability to stay calm and level-headed, even in situations that would have made most people lose their temper. The kids, meanwhile, were still running around the yard, playing games with their cousins. Their laughter filled the air again, light and carefree. A few of the adults were sitting at the picnic table, chatting about everything from the weather to upcoming events, but it was clear that everyone was enjoying themselves. The father couldn't help but smile as he watched his children, his pride and joy, having so much fun. After all, this was what it was all about: family, love, and the simple moments that made life so precious. As the evening wore on and the sun began to dip lower in the sky, the BBQ started winding down. The smell of grilled food lingered in the air, and people started gathering their things, preparing to head home. The father was cleaning up the grill when he noticed Mr. Thompson once again standing on his porch, staring over at the backyard. It wasn't unusual for him to be there. He often spent his evenings watching what was going on next door, though he didn't seem to engage with anyone. This time, though, something was different. The father wasn't sure if it was because of their earlier conversation, but Mr. Thompson didn't have his usual stern look on his face. Instead, he seemed thoughtful. The father hesitated for a moment, then decided that now might be as good a time as any to try to extend an olive branch. It wasn't about becoming best friends with Mr. Thompson, but it was about taking a small step towards rebuilding some kind of understanding. The father walked over toward the fence that separated their yards, taking a moment to glance back at the guests who were finishing up their meals. He wanted to make sure everything was still going smoothly before stepping out of his own space. When he reached the edge of the fence, Mr. Thompson looked up, and for the first time that day, the old man gave a small nod. "Evening," the father called out, his voice friendly but not overly eager. He didn't want to make Mr. Thompson feel uncomfortable. Mr. Thompson seemed to hesitate for a moment before responding, his voice a little rough but not unfriendly. "Evening." The father paused, looking over at the man. He had always thought of Mr. Thompson as a difficult neighbor, someone who didn't seem to care about building relationships. But today, he was seeing something different. A man who was perhaps just lonely, or maybe a little misunderstood. The father knew that life wasn't always easy, and sometimes people acted out in ways that didn't make sense. Maybe Mr. Thompson just needed a reminder that kindness could go a long way. "I hope you didn't mind the noise earlier," the father said, his tone sincere. "We didn't mean to disrupt your evening." Mr. Thompson didn't say anything at first, but the father could see the slightest shift in his expression. For a brief second, his face softened. "No, it's fine," Mr. Thompson finally muttered. I guess I'm just not used to all the activity around here. The father smiled, nodding in understanding. I get it. We all have our moments when things get a little too much. But if you ever feel like joining us for one of these gatherings, you're always welcome. There was a pause before Mr. Thompson spoke again. This time, his voice was quieter, more thoughtful. Maybe I'll take you up on that sometime. Just not today. The father chuckled softly. Of course, no pressure. The next few days after the BBQ felt different. The father had expected things to go back to the usual routine, small waves across the fence, brief exchanges in passing, and the occasional polite smile. But something had changed, and he couldn't quite put his finger on it. It wasn't just about the conversation with Mr. Thompson. It was the way the whole neighborhood seemed to settle into a quieter rhythm. The tension that had always been there, just below the surface, seemed to have lifted slightly, as if the father's calm handling of the situation had created a small ripple of change. On his way out to work one morning, the father noticed Mr. Thompson standing in his front yard, watering his plants. Normally, he would have just kept walking, nodding briefly if they made eye contact. But today was different. The father hesitated for a moment before deciding to take a chance. "Morning," he said, offering a friendly wave. Mr. Thompson looked up, his expression unreadable at first. The father had no idea what to expect. But then, to his surprise, the old man nodded and even gave a small wave back. It wasn't much, but it felt like progress. The father smiled to himself as he continued down the street. It wasn't a major breakthrough, but in a neighborhood where small gestures of kindness had often been overlooked, this simple exchange felt like a small victory. Over the next week, the two men exchanged greetings more often. There were no long conversations, just brief interactions as they crossed paths in the yard or on the sidewalk. It wasn't the beginning of a new friendship, but it was enough. The father had learned that sometimes it's the little things that matter most, the simple acts of acknowledging each other, the quiet moments of understanding that help build a foundation of respect. He was content with that. As the weather started to warm up, the family decided to have another small get-together in the backyard. It wasn't the big BBQ they had hosted earlier, just a simple dinner with close friends and neighbors. The father wasn't sure if Mr. Thompson would show up, but he had invited him, just in case. It wasn't about forcing the issue. It was about extending an invitation, opening the door for a possible connection. He didn't expect Mr. Thompson to come, but he knew that offering the chance was important. When the evening came, the father found himself glancing over at Mr. Thompson's house more than once, wondering if the old man would make an appearance. The party was already in full swing, with laughter and music filling the air as the kids ran around playing games. The father didn't want to make a big deal out of it, but he couldn't help but hope that Mr. Thompson might be open to joining in. After all, it was a simple dinner, not a huge event. If the old man wanted to be part of it, he was more than welcome. Around halfway through the evening, as the father was sitting at the picnic table chatting with some of the neighbors, he noticed a shadow near the fence. It was Mr. Thompson. The father felt his heart skip a beat. Was he really coming over? He stood up slowly, not wanting to make a scene. "Hey there," he called out casually, walking toward the fence. Mr. Thompson was standing at the edge of his yard, looking over at the party. He didn't say anything at first, just observing. There was a brief, uncomfortable silence, but the father didn't mind. He had invited the old man, and now it was up to him whether or not he wanted to join. I brought some pie," Mr. Thompson said after a moment, holding up a small tin. "Figured I'd share it with everyone." The father couldn't help but smile. It wasn't the most natural of gestures, but it was a kind one, and it spoke volumes. "Thanks, Mr. Thompson," the father said. "Come on over, everyone's welcome." The old man hesitated for a moment longer, then slowly made his way toward the backyard. The father could see the uncertainty in his steps, but he didn't rush him. It was clear that this was a big step for Mr. Thompson, and he didn't want to pressure him. As the night went on, Mr. Thompson stayed mostly on the edge of the group, quietly observing and contributing here and there to conversations. He didn't stay long, but he didn't leave immediately either. The father was surprised to find that he enjoyed having him there, even if it was just for a short while. It wasn't about forcing someone into a social setting, but about allowing them the space to join when they felt ready. By the time the evening ended, Mr. Thompson had said his goodbyes and left the party early, but the father felt a sense of accomplishment. It wasn't the perfect interaction. There was still a long way to go before they could be considered friends, but there had been progress. The man who had once been so distant, so quick to judge, had taken a small step toward connection. A few weeks had passed since the dinner, and the atmosphere in the neighborhood seemed to have shifted ever so slightly. The father had never expected Mr. Thompson to suddenly become a regular guest at their gatherings, but the small changes were enough to make him feel that things were slowly moving in a better direction. It wasn't about trying to force a friendship. It was about the simple realization that even the smallest acts of kindness could chip away at years of silence and misunderstanding. The father continued with his daily routine: work, family, errands. But there was always a part of him that kept an eye out for Mr. Thompson. He wasn't obsessing over it, but he noticed the little things. The old man waving more often, the small conversations they'd have when their paths crossed. The father had grown used to the stillness of their previous interactions, the unspoken distance that always lingered. But now, it felt like there was a new openness, a kind of quiet understanding between them. One morning, while the father was out walking his dog, he saw Mr. Thompson in his front yard again. The old man was standing at the edge of his garden, holding a rake and carefully tidying up the flowers that lined his driveway. The father could have easily just waved and moved on, as he'd done many times before. But today, something was different. He paused for a moment, then called over, "Morning, Mr. Thompson. How's the garden looking?" Mr. Thompson glanced up, and to the father's surprise, he smiled. It wasn't a wide smile, just a small, sincere one, but it was enough. "It's getting there," he replied, his voice soft but warm. "Could use a little rain, though. Haven't had a good storm in a while." The father nodded. "I know what you mean. The weather's been all over the place lately." They stood there for a moment, in a quiet, easy kind of silence, neither of them feeling the need to rush through the conversation. It was strange, in a good way. The father wasn't used to this new dynamic, this shift where small talk didn't feel forced or awkward. For the first time, he felt like he was really seeing Mr. Thompson, not just the old man who lived next door, but a person with his own thoughts, his own world. After a few moments, Mr. Thompson spoke again. "You know, I've been thinking about that BBQ you had last month," he said, his tone thoughtful. "It was nice. You've got a good family there." The father was taken aback for a moment. He had never imagined Mr. Thompson would reflect on the event in a positive way. He had expected more complaints or even indifference, but this was different. "Thanks," the father said, genuinely touched by the compliment. "We're a loud bunch, but we try to keep it fun." Mr. Thompson chuckled softly. "You guys weren't so bad. It's just that, well, I've been living alone for a while, and I'm not used to a lot of noise." His voice trailed off for a second, and the father could sense a vulnerability in his words. It was a rare glimpse into the life of a man who had always been distant, always closed off. The father didn't want to push too much, but he decided to take a chance. "If you ever want to come by for another BBQ, or just some company, you're always welcome," he said, his voice warm but not forceful. Mr. Thompson looked at him for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly as if he were considering the offer. The father held his breath, unsure of what the old man would say. Finally, after a long pause, Mr. Thompson nodded slowly. "Maybe one day," he said. "I'll think about it." It wasn't a solid commitment, but it was progress. The father smiled, nodding back, No rush. Just know the door's always open. As the father continued his walk, he couldn't help but feel a sense of hope. It wasn't about Mr. Thompson suddenly becoming part of the family. It was about the small, steady steps forward. Even if the old man never came to another gathering, the fact that he was now open to the possibility felt like a victory. Back at home, the father shared the exchange with his wife. He actually talked about the BBQ, he said, sitting down at the kitchen table. Said it wasn't so bad. His wife smiled, looking up from the dishes she was washing. That's a good sign. I think so, the father said, leaning back in his chair. It's not a big change, but it's something. Over the next few days, there were more of these small interactions between the two men. They exchanged greetings more regularly, sometimes stopping for brief chats about the weather, the neighborhood, or even their families. The father began to understand that Mr. Thompson wasn't just a grumpy old man. He was someone who had been isolated for a long time, someone who had lost touch with a sense of community around him. As time went on, the father found himself thinking more and more about the small interactions with Mr. Thompson. They were brief, but they always left him with a sense of something important unfolding between them. He had been right not to expect overnight changes, but the slow progress was still something to be proud of. There were still moments of tension, still that lingering sense of distance, but with every conversation, it felt a little less noticeable. One Saturday afternoon, the family decided to have a small picnic in the park. It wasn't anything fancy, just sandwiches, snacks, and a few drinks, but it was a chance for everyone to relax and enjoy a sunny day together. The kids were excited, running around the house, packing up toys and games. It was the kind of simple joy that the father loved to watch, seeing his family so happy with the little things. As they were getting ready to leave, the father noticed Mr. Thompson outside, sitting on his porch and reading the newspaper. It was rare to see him so relaxed, especially in the afternoon when he was usually working on his yard or just quietly keeping to himself. For a moment, the father hesitated. Should he stop by and say hello? Was it too much to invite him again? After a moment's thought, the father decided to take the chance. If Mr. Thompson wasn't interested, he could always politely decline, but it felt right to extend another invitation. He walked over to the fence and waved. "Hey, Mr. Thompson," he called, his voice casual but friendly. "We're heading to the park for a picnic. If you want to join us, there's always space." At first, Mr. Thompson didn't respond right away. He just kept reading, his expression hard to read. The father stood there for a moment, feeling the tension building. Maybe it was too soon to ask again. Maybe it felt forced. But then, just as the father was about to turn back toward his car, Mr. Thompson set down his paper and stood up slowly. "You know," he said, his voice low but steady, "I might just take you up on that." The father blinked, surprised. He hadn't expected the old man to say yes. There was a long pause as Mr. Thompson adjusted his jacket, as if getting ready to leave his comfort zone. Finally, he stepped forward toward the fence. "I'll join you for a little while," he said, his tone still cautious, but it was clear he was making an effort. The father smiled, feeling a mix of relief and excitement. "Great. It'll be nice to have you there. We're just going to the park down the street." He didn't want to push too hard, so he kept the details simple. "Just a laid-back day, you know." Mr. Thompson gave a short nod. "I'll grab my things." He didn't seem overly eager, but he didn't back out either. It was a start. As the family piled into the car and drove to the park, the father couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror, where he saw Mr. Thompson walking down the street behind them, slowly making his way toward the park. It wasn't a big gesture, but it was something. The old man had stepped outside of his usual routine, and for the father, that was a meaningful change. When they arrived at the park, the kids rushed out of the car, excited to play in the open space. The father set up a blanket and began unpacking the food while his wife went to talk to some friends who were already there. But as they set up, the father couldn't help but glance toward the path, watching for Mr. Thompson's arrival. It didn't take long before the old man appeared, walking slowly but steadily toward their picnic spot. He wasn't exactly mingling with the crowd, but he made his way over to where the father was sitting, quietly sitting down beside him on the grass. "I hope I'm not interrupting," Mr. Thompson said, his voice gruff but polite. "Just wanted to see what it was all about." The father smiled, feeling grateful for the effort. "You're not interrupting at all. Everyone's welcome." Mr. Thompson nodded, his eyes scanning the park. The kids were playing a game of tag, running around with big smiles on their faces, and the other families were chatting and laughing, creating a warm, friendly atmosphere. Mr. Thompson seemed to be watching them with a hint of curiosity, though he didn't join in. He sat back, leaning against a tree, his eyes softened as he observed the simple joy of the children and the families around him. The father noticed a change in Mr. Thompson's demeanor. The man wasn't just the grumpy, reclusive neighbor anymore. There was a sense of quiet appreciation in the way he was watching. It was as if he was seeing the world in a new light, understanding what he had been missing all this time. Throughout the afternoon, the father and Mr. Thompson exchanged a few words, but mostly, they sat in comfortable silence. Weeks passed, and life in the neighborhood continued to settle into a rhythm. The father noticed that things had shifted even further since that picnic in the park. Mr. Thompson was no longer just a quiet figure in the background. There was a new sense of ease between them, one that had been slowly built on small acts of kindness, shared moments, and the simple willingness to step out of comfort zones. It wasn't that they were best friends now, but there was an unspoken understanding that hadn't existed before. One afternoon, the father was in his garage working on a project when he heard a knock on his door. He was a little surprised to see Mr. Thompson standing there when he opened it. The old man was holding a small box wrapped in plain brown paper, looking a bit out of place but determined. "Got something for you," Mr. Thompson said, holding the package out to him. The father blinked in surprise. "For me? What's this?" "Just a little something," Mr. Thompson replied, his face softened by an unfamiliar smile. "I know you guys like to grill a lot, and I thought you could use it." Curious, the father took the box and opened it carefully. Inside, he found a set of high-quality grilling tools, spatula, tongs, and a basting brush, all neatly packed and wrapped in felt. It was an unexpected gift, and the father felt a sudden rush of appreciation. "Mr. Thompson, you didn't have to. This is really thoughtful of you," the father said, genuinely touched. He had never expected anything like this from the old man. It was one thing to offer small conversations and pleasantries, but this felt like something much more meaningful. Mr. Thompson shrugged, his expression a little embarrassed but still sincere. "I don't know much about grilling, but I've seen you out there a lot. Thought they might be useful." The father smiled, feeling the warmth in Mr. Thompson's words. "I'll put them to good use, I promise," he said. There was a short, awkward pause, as though Mr. Thompson wasn't quite sure how to follow up his gesture. But then he spoke again, this time more quietly. I've been meaning to apologize for the way I acted when I first moved here. I didn't make much of an effort to get to know you guys. I was a little stuck in my own ways." The father looked at him, surprised by the honesty in his words. It was rare for someone like Mr. Thompson to open up like this, especially after all these years of distance. The father paused for a moment before responding, choosing his words carefully. "It's okay, Mr. Thompson. We all have our reasons for how we act. I'm just glad we've had the chance to connect." The old man gave a slow nod, his gaze softening. "I should have made an effort sooner. I guess sometimes it takes a while to realize the importance of the little things. I didn't see it at first." The father couldn't help but agree. "Yeah, sometimes it's the small things that matter the most." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The father felt a quiet sense of understanding settle between them, one that was born out of time and patience. The old man had been isolated for so long, wrapped in his own world of quiet routines, and now, here he was, offering something simple but significant. "I'm glad we've gotten to know each other better," the father said, his voice warm. "I really appreciate the gift. It means a lot." Mr. Thompson gave a slight smile, his eyes flickering toward the grilling tools. "Well, you're welcome. I know it's not much, but I thought it might be helpful." The father chuckled softly. "Trust me, it's more than enough." As the old man turned to leave, the father couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude. It wasn't just about the gift. It was about the journey they had both taken, however small. The walls between them, once so high, were crumbling, replaced by simple gestures and quiet moments of understanding. That evening, the father couldn't wait to fire up the grill and try out the new tools. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden glow over the backyard, and the air smelled of grilled food. As he worked, he thought about the changes that had come to the neighborhood over the past few months. He hadn't expected any of it, but it had all happened naturally, through kindness, patience, and the willingness to reach out. Later that night, as the family gathered around the dinner table, the father shared the story of the gift with them. "Mr. Thompson stopped by today," he said, holding up the grilling tools. "He gave me these, and he even apologized for how he acted when he first moved in." His wife raised an eyebrow, surprised. "Really? That's unexpected." The father nodded. "Yeah, it's amazing how one small step can lead to something bigger. I think he's finally realizing what he's been missing all this time." The kids, hearing about the gift, excitedly asked if they could have a barbecue soon. The father laughed and promised they'd have one soon. Months passed, and things between the father and Mr. Thompson continued to improve, though not in dramatic, sweeping ways. Instead, it was the small, consistent changes that made all the difference. Neighbors who once barely acknowledged each other were now exchanging casual greetings when they saw each other outside. The old man, who used to stay hidden behind his closed doors, was beginning to venture out more often, even waving to others when they passed by. The father was amazed at how something so simple, like an invitation or a kind word, had made such an impact. One afternoon, as the father was working in the garden, he noticed Mr. Thompson approaching his front yard. He had a small package under his arm, and as he walked up, he called out to the father, "Got something for you." The father paused his work and smiled, surprised but not entirely shocked anymore. This kind of gesture had become more common between them. "What is it this time?" he asked, wiping his hands on his jeans. "It's just a little something I thought you'd appreciate," Mr. Thompson replied, handing over the package. "I was out running errands and saw it. Thought you could use it." The father took the package, his curiosity piqued. He unwrapped it to find a new set of grilling accessories, a smoker box and some flavored wood chips for smoking meat. It was a thoughtful gift, especially considering how much the father loved to grill. "That's great. Thanks, Mr. Thompson," the father said with a grin. "I'll definitely put these to use. You know, we've got a barbecue coming up soon. You should come by. We'll throw something on the grill. Make it a fun evening." Mr. Thompson paused for a moment, then nodded. "I might just take you up on that," he said, though his voice still carried the hint of hesitation that was typical for him. "I don't usually get out much, but it's nice to feel like I'm part of things now." The father's smile softened. "You're always welcome. It's not just about the food, it's about the company. We're neighbors, after all." Mr. Thompson gave a small, almost shy smile. "I suppose that's true." As the weeks continued, more invitations were extended, and more visits were made. Slowly but surely, Mr. Thompson began to feel like a real part of the neighborhood. He came to the family's barbecues, joined in on casual talks while the kids played outside, and even began helping with small tasks around the yard when the father needed an extra hand. His efforts weren't grand gestures. He didn't suddenly become the life of the party, nor did he transform into the warm, outgoing person the father might have imagined. But the change was clear, and it mattered. The father began to notice that Mr. Thompson was no longer the isolated, distant neighbor he once was. Little by little, he started to open up about his past, about the things that had shaped him into the person he was today. He shared stories from his childhood, his time in the military, and the relationships he had with people long gone. These were the moments that the father cherished. They were quiet and sometimes difficult, but they deepened the bond between them. It was clear that Mr. Thompson was finding healing in his connections, something he had long been missing. One evening, while they were sitting on the back porch, sipping cold drinks after another successful barbecue, Mr. Thompson looked over at the father with a thoughtful expression. "You know," he began, his voice low and reflective, "I didn't expect to end up here. I didn't expect to make friends at this point in my life. I'd kind of given up on that." The father raised an eyebrow, surprised by the honesty in Mr. Thompson's words. "I get that," he said gently. "Sometimes life just gets in the way of those things. But I think it's never too late." Mr. Thompson nodded, taking a deep breath. "Yeah, I'm starting to see that. It's just hard sometimes to let go of old ways of thinking." The father smiled, understanding. "I know what you mean, but I think it's about finding the right people, the ones who make it easier to let go of those old walls. And I think you found a few here." The old man didn't say anything right away, but his expression softened as if the weight of his words had settled into place. For the first time in a long time, he looked content, truly content, as though he had found a new sense of peace. The father sat back in his chair, feeling a deep sense of pride. It wasn't just about what had happened between him and Mr. Thompson. It was about how the neighborhood had changed. People who once barely spoke were now sharing stories, laughing together, and looking out for one another. There was a new sense of community in the air, one that had formed naturally over time, through simple gestures of kindness and an open heart.